right, how's everybody doing? The first piece we're going to be looking at this week is our realist piece for the week, and it's The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. Now, we're going to relate this story to the realist movement, but we're also going to look at it in terms of structure. If you remember, this first window here is from your Basic Elements of Literary Analysis PDF that I posted the first or second week, the second, I believe. And, there's a ton of information in there. It starts with the basic elements of literature, and then, if you recall, it gets into a laundry list of different literary and poetic devices, etc. Um, so remember, the basic elements of literature is you have to have a plot, you have to have characters, you have to have a setting, there's a point of view or perspective, and a story has to have themes or a theme, right? Now, we will address all of these, but first let's think about structure. So here we have the Freytag pyramid. Um, it is one way of analyzing or structuring a story. I'll tell you right off the bat that Kate Chopin wrote The Story of an Hour as an exercise in utilizing the Freytag pyramid, and we'll see with the falling action, she kind of throws in a little bit of wit in the way that she addresses that and lets it play out in the story itself. Now, so what we're going to do is we will identify all of these elements as we go through it, and then we'll talk about it as a realist piece. I'm not going to tell you the themes because that is going to be one of your reading response questions. But first, our plot, right? Assuming you have all read the story, you know the plot is fairly standard. One could easily say it has to do with a woman finding out that her husband died, then finding out in actuality that he did not die, and suffering from a heart attack and dying upon his return. But as you know, there's much more in there, right? So, in terms of the Freytag structure, right, the first part is going to be your exposition or introduction, right? And this is the beginning of the story where your characters and your setting are established and the conflict or main problem is introduced. Keep in mind, in any story, you can't have a rising action before at least one conflict is introduced, right? So, our exposition. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with the heart trouble, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So already we are starting to establish some characters, right? We have Mrs. Mallard, we have her husband, even though at this point we believe him to be deceased, and we have some potential ideas of conflict, right? We know she has to deal with the death of her husband. We have this bit of foreshadowing here that says that she's afflicted with a heart trouble, right? Remember, foreshadowing is a literary device whereby an author drops hints or symbolic representations of plot developments that will come later in the story. There are two types of foreshadowing. You have direct and indirect foreshadowing. This would be an example of indirect foreshadowing, right? You can't kind of pick it out right away and be like, oh, that's going to obviously come up later. Though you could argue it can, direct and indirect foreshadowing can kind of get into gray, debatable areas. But we have some foreshadowing, right? It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed and half concealing her husband's friend Richards, was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram, and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. So, in terms of, we're still in our introduction, right? We're still establishing more characters. We have Mrs. Mallard's sister Josephine. We know her husband's name, right? Brentley Mallard. And we know that he has a friend, Richards, right? And we know that Richards has waited around to make sure that he's actually passed away, and he wants to get home as quickly as possible to let Mrs. Mallard know, because he's aware of her heart condition, right? And he would like to not forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message, right? So he believes, he'll be able to inform her in a way that's not going to be a shock, right? Because no one wants to shock her because of her heart condition. So our conflicts are revealed, right? This is kind of our main conflict, right? The conflict is not the fact that her husband has died in a train accident. That's the fact of the story. The conflict really is letting her know this information in such a manner as not to shock her, right? Even though that seems like an impossible feat. So then we have our rising action, right, which occurs when a series of events build up to the conflict. The main characters are established by this time, the rising action of the plot occurs, and at the same time, events begin to get complicated. It is during this part of the story that excitement, tension, or crisis is encountered. Remember, the conflict is the spark that ignites the action in the story, right? Knowing the conflict allows the reader to pinpoint the climax. Now, this is where the story gets more interesting, right? She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the story of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her, right? So obviously she finds out that her husband died. She breaks down, she cries with her sister, but then she retreats back to her bedroom to be left alone, right? Now, this is where things become a little bit more interesting, right? So, there stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that had haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her, the open window, her house, the tops of trees that were all aquiver with new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which some one was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were blue patches of sky showing her here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. So, we have this very idyllic description of springtime, right? And as we talked about in When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed, and with 207 by Emily Dickinson, that spring is a constantly reoccurring symbol or metaphor, right, throughout literature. Um, and it is a universal symbol, right? Because again, also on your basic elements of literary analysis PDF, there's a whole section on symbolism, which you should check out, and it just breaks down, different types of symbols. But spring would be a universal symbol, right? And universal in the sense that it's conventional and has a meaning that is well known as a whole within society, right? It's easily identifiable. So here's another hint in a lot of ways, right? If our setting, which we could establish now as the Mallard's house, we have not been given a specific time, right? Because setting consists of time and place. Um, Though, if you read the footnote at the top, it's first published in 1894, I believe, or 5. And since, Chopin has not set it in the past or the future, we can take the setting being at the present during the time, right? Another characteristic, which we didn't fully address about realism, is if, most realist stories take place within the time that they are written. But we have this description of spring, right? So this is a time of renewal, right? A time of rebirth. So we can apply that to Mrs. Mallard, right? That symbol can latch on to her. She sat there. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the air chair, quite motionless except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought, right? So, she's in shock in one way or another, as we're about to find out. And we're slowly starting to reach our climax, right? If you think you have your intro, we've established everything. You have your rising action when things start to take place, right? Which come to a peak at the climax, right? And you can almost feel it here, right? Chopin kind of writes this final rising action out. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been, right? So we can feel this rise occurring, right? And it's a rise occurring in Mrs. Mallard, right? It's this emotion that, a second ago she was in shock, but now there's this feeling kind of rising up in her that she can't name or pinpoint. And it scares her. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulse beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were not a monstrous joy that held her, right? So here's our climax, right? Mrs. Mallard has come to a realization. We go back to the symbol of spring and this description of everything which it entails, and we can apply that to Mrs. Mallard, right? She's being renewed and rebirthed in some way or another, right? She's evolving, and that evolution is the realization that she's free, right? Now, it's not been established that Mr. Mallard is a particularly terrible husband or an abusive one, but this is when setting becomes important, right? It's the 1890s. It's a time when women really don't have a lot of their own rights. Remember from our historical Gilded Age lecture that, women don't have the right to vote. They can't really, not respected if they're not married, etc., right? But this freedom from kind of being under her husband's thumb, regardless of if he's a bad husband or not, that's just gender dynamics at the time, right? But she realizes that that's not the case anymore, right? She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, so obviously he's not a terrible person. The face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead, but she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. A bit of a biographical note. Kate Chopin's husband did not die in a train accident, but he did die young. So Chopin was then left to live her life out how she wanted, and she did that by writing. So there is a bit of autobiography kind of stuck into the story. Um, There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature, right? So it's this idea of, you know, being in a relationship and that partner believing that, they can tell you what to do, essentially, which obviously would be much more so the case of Mr. Mallard pressing his ideas and desires and beliefs upon Mrs. Mallard, just because of gender dynamics at the time. She goes on, we have, and yet she loved him sometimes, often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. So, we're in the midst of our climax, right? And our story ends very quickly. Josephine comes in. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door, I beg, open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away, I'm not making myself ill, etc., etc. Now, here we're post the climax now, right? So now we're in our falling action. And in the falling action, or the winding up of the story, occurs when events and complications begin to resolve. The result of the actions of the main characters are put forward. So, this is Chopin's little trick. If you think about this Freytag pyramid, we're here at the top, at the climax. Then we have our falling action. We are going down until we reach our conclusion, or denouement, which I'll explain in a second. Chopin does that in a rather witty way by having the falling action occur with Josephine and Mrs. Mallard literally descending the stairs together. And Richards is waiting at the bottom, right? So, our conclusion comes very quickly. Someone was opening the door with the latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry as Richards' quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. But Richards was too late, right? That goes all the way back to the fact that Mrs. Mallard has a heart condition and that Richards believed he was the best person to let Mrs. Mallard know of her husband's death because he would inform her in a way that hopefully wouldn't upset her. But here, she gets a shock. Even though Richards tries to block the door, he doesn't in time. When the doctors came, they said she died of heart disease, of joy that kills. So she died of a broken heart, right? And that's because she now has had this epiphany that she's free, right? She can do whatever she wants. She can be the person that she's always wanted to be without having to conform to someone else's ideas of what a good wife is or a partner, etc. Right? She can be free. And when that realization hits, she collapses and she dies, right? So there comes our resolution or conclusion, or dénouement in French, meaning the action of untying, which we'll talk about in a second. We have the end of the story, which may occur with either a happy or a tragic ending. Obviously, we have a tragic ending here. Now, the dénouement, right, again, meaning the action of untying in French, is a form of a conclusion. It doesn't occur in every story. Essentially, what it means is that not that the ending of the story is left open for interpretation per se, but that the accumulation of everything from the story that occurs leaves the reader, the audience, etc., with kind of a spark or a thought that continues once you close the page or once the movie ends. The argument is that is when the story really begins. And there can be, again, universal denouements, or they can, occur individually for different viewers, readers, etc. Right? If you ever finish a TV show or a movie or a book, etc., and when you turn it off or you close the page, you just keep thinking about it, right? And the story really starts to unravel in your head, and it leads to something more, right? That's what a denouement is. So if we were to take the ending of this story as a denouement, we could say that it exists in the vein of thinking about why Mrs. Mallard was so elated to be free of her husband, right? Even though she loved him some of the times, and even though it's established that he was, a good husband in one way or another, at the very least, not a bad one, right? So, we have this short, very quick, poignant story. And, in terms of a good story makes you think. A good story has a lot packed in there, right? I mean, we have a lot going on in a 2-page story. Again, the plot itself is fairly simple, but the questions that it evokes are much more important, right? You have to think about personal freedoms, right? What it means to be stuck in a relationship that just doesn't work. You could think about gender roles at the time and gender dynamics. We could consider the concept of fate, right? Is this the time? Was this Mrs. Mallard's fate, right? To never truly be free. Um, you know, so it opens up a lot of different ideas. Now, in terms of being a realist piece, yes, it's very short, but again, it takes place within the time which it was written. We have a upper middle class group of characters, right, which is a very important part, characteristic of realism at the time. And then remember, our other major characteristics are going to be kind of a colloquial language, right? So not an elevated language. Um, there is not a lot of dialogue in this story. It's really just Mrs. Mallard and her sister asking her if she's okay, but there's nothing kind of elevated in that language whatsoever. And it's not an unbelievable story, right? It's arguably, if this happened in real life, it would be a wild story, but it's not unrealistic, right? Um, the real focus of the story is Mrs. Mallard's newly attained sense of freedom. And that's really what we're supposed to latch onto as readers. And that is a very realistic and understandable and relatable emotion, right? So, all the things that also make it a realist story. Um, yeah. If you like Kate Chopin's work, I recommend checking out the rest of her pieces in the story. They're not this short, but they are not long. I think the longest one is like 4 or 5 pages. Desiree's Baby is very, very good as well. Um, so keep that in mind. Okay, I will have your Jack London naturalism, excuse me, um, recording up later today, and I hope everyone's having a good week.